Hello Zero Books readers and viewers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll be considering the unrest and protests that swept across the United States in late May and early June in an attempt to understand the impasse we've reached and how it could be that even as insurrection is raging, an ideology that the late Mark Fisher, a UK cultural critic on the left, called Capitalist Realism could continue. In 2009, Mark Fisher began his book Capitalist Realism with the observation that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. What we are learning now is that it is also much easier to act on the impulse or the desire to end the world than it is to attempt to overcome capitalist relations. Given the worldwide pandemic, the racist police, the economic collapse, and the crushing authoritarianism coming from all sides, we are charged with the task to change the world, but instead, the left only seems capable of acting without thinking. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and hit that bell. Even better, you might consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to all of our podcasts, including 2 new series, one on Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, and the other on the communizer Gilles Dauvé and his book From Crisis to Communization. Starting in August, we'll also be introducing a monthly podcast series on Trotsky and the Russian Revolution for patrons. Support us on Patreon and join us in learning critical theory with the aim of changing society. This video will attempt to examine the cause of our disintegration by looking back to the past. Specifically, we'll consider the Quietism of the Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno and contrast his despair against the revolutionary optimism of Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg and Heinrich Grossman, who were confident that the left could take advantage of what they called revolutionary situations. After immigrating to America to escape the Nazis, Adorno ended up in California in 1941, finding himself surrounded by smiling, suntanned Americans. Making his way through supermarkets and up and down the television dial, Adorno was, as he put it, liberated from his naive belief in culture. He had escaped fascism in Germany only to find proto-fascism in America. And as the years rolled by, he found himself as disgusted by what called itself the left as he was by hula hoops and bikinis. Even when he returned to Germany, he couldn't escape the new young leftists, the protesters who, it seemed to him, were mostly enthralled with themselves and who he thought were sliding into barbarism. It's important to remember that Adorno was just one member of the Frankfurt School, and that the formation of the Institute was the result of the failure of German socialism in 1919. The aim of the Institute was to bring the various strains of Marxism together in an attempt to return to Marx, and in an attempt to hold on to the theory that had informed the struggles for socialism in the 19th century. They wanted to resist either being servants of the Soviet Union or apparatchiks in the Social Democratic Weimar Republic. But by 1962, one of the students who took part in the original week-long workshop that would give birth to the Institute, the Marxist Lukács, turned against this attempt to create a third way for socialism. He condemned the Western Marxists of the Frankfurt School, and particularly Theodor Adorno, for having taken up residence in what he called, metaphorically, the Grand Hotel Abyss. The Frankfurt School scholars lived, he wrote, quote, in a place equipped with every comfort, on the edge of an abyss of nothingness, of absurdity. In the daily contemplation of the abyss between excellent meals or artistic entertainments only heightened their enjoyment of the subtle comforts offered. As I recently read Adorno's 1969 essay Marginilia on Theory and Praxis, a work that attempted to overcome what he saw as a split between Marxist theory and Marxist practice, and as I watched live streams from the streets of Portland, my hometown, I could not only see the kernel of truth in Lukács' assessment, but could imagine myself residing in the Grand Hotel Abyss as well. Actually, I imagined myself living in something more like the squalid Motel Abyss. Adorno's hotel might have been filled with beauty and refinement, but my abode was littered with used medical-grade masks, piles of lurid paperbacks and turgid theory books, and smelled of dust and unwashed laundry. The only amenity worth noting in the squalid motel abyss is the access to high-speed internet. As the protests rage on, and as the Department of Homeland Security is deployed in order to empower a clown president, I feel there is at least one key idea from Adorno that is worth holding on to, namely his critique of actionism, or of the tendency for people to frantically close their eyes to the totality of society and behave as though society is produced immediately and willfully by the people within it. The protesters behave as if they are already free, and this is to their advantage and disadvantage both. It is an advantage in so much as it is only as free and willful subjects as subjects willing to break from society that we'll be able to create a new world. It is a disadvantage because the terms of our subjectivity and our will are set by the totality of the system from which we are trying to escape. To understand the potential consequences of acting as though we are already free, as if we've already overcome the impasse, we might consider something I recently heard on a podcast produced by the centrist liberal publication Vox.
We're not actually asking a lot more of the police departments. We're just telling them, like, we're mad, so we're going to give you less money.
We're just going to give you less money. Yeah. But expect exactly the same amount of everything. And there isn't really a clear plan yet to shift a bunch of the responsibility to some other outfit, right? Which I think is, again, what reformers are pushing for, is to basically have some sort of like force of social workers or something that takes a lot of the calls. But that's going to take a while to set up. Another thing I've heard about recently, so there's I think at least in Seattle, surely in other places, the research department, the data people in the police department are on the chopping block.
Right.
So basically, if these police departments are facing huge budget cuts, their number one priority is having officers out on the street to deal with crime. And so all that other stuff, the extras like researchers and data analysts, are going to be the first to go. And certainly as a researcher, I'm a little biased here, but I feel like those officers are really important. And like you said earlier, if we want to figure out what works, then we need to make the data available. And those officers are crucial if we want to be moving forward in that direction. So I think you're exactly right that, there's the defund the police movement that advocates are pushing for looks very different than what we are likely to see on the ground, where city councils are just trying to appease angry residents. And they're just going to cut the budget, and we're likely to see crime go up. We're likely to see it be even harder to recruit good officers. That to me seems very unlikely to be the solution.
In 1969, Adorno and another Frankfurt School philosopher were at cross purposes regarding the New Left in the Vietnam War. Marcuse, whose ideas and personality would end up being the subject of articles and publications such as Fortune and Playboy, was a champion of the youth. As an aside, when Marcuse was originally approached by Hefner for an interview in 1970, he informed him that he'd be willing to do it if he could also be the centerfold model in the issue. Eventually, a profile appeared without any nudes. Adorno wrote to Marcuse to complain about the young protesters after they'd interrupted one of his lectures at the Free University in Berlin. Adorno claimed that the activists were only deepening the very problems they ostensibly wanted to overcome. He wrote, quote, "I do not doubt for a moment that the student movement in its current form is heading towards the very technocratization of the university that it claims it wants to prevent. Indeed, it's heading in that direction quite directly." While it's difficult to know whether the neoliberal university we are faced with today is a result of the New Left's defeat or whether it represents the New Left's victory, it is easy to see that what Adorno said of the German student radicals in '69 applies to the Portland protests today. Adorno claimed that the attacks on his lectures were organized specifically to create a situation wherein the police would be called in, and that this conflict with the police was what was going to hold together an otherwise disintegrating student movement. This attack by the cops would create a pseudo-solidarity. Today we are seeing the same idea, the same tactic. After the unrest of late May and early June, those who would conceive of themselves as radicals are aiming at nothing but the recapturing of the energy and solidarity they initially felt after the murder of George Floyd. And what is most distressing is that it is Donald Trump who is helping them. It is something of a Chinese finger trap. The activities of the Portland protesters gave Trump the opportunity to use the Department of Homeland Security in precisely the ways that left critics have always warned were likely since the institution's creation after 9/11. And Trump's repressive tactics are boxing the protesters in, both figuratively and literally. To leave the streets in a strategic retreat in mid-July might have been possible, but to do so today would appear to be to accept and normalize the authoritarian and perhaps unconstitutional exertion of violence from the executive. According to Rosa Luxemburg, there are 3 tenets of what she called scientific socialism, and the first one is this: the growing anarchy of capitalist economic relations leads inevitably to ruin. In a recent video, I mentioned that the first crisis within Marxism occurred around 1893, and it occurred when something called the Long Depression ended. The Long Depression started in the United States when the banking firm J. Cook and Company closed its doors and declared bankruptcy. The firm had financed the Union effort during the Civil War and then took on the responsibility of financing national railroad construction, and when the firm went bankrupt, a quarter of the nation's railroads went bankrupt along with it. Strikes followed, specifically railroad strikes. And if you've been paying attention to recent developments in Portland, that is, if you've been reading the various debates about what historical precedents exist to justify Trump's use of the Department of Homeland Security, you'll know what happened next. Republican President Ruther B. Hayes sent in the army to break the nationwide railroad strike of 1877. At the request of the governors, troops were moved into Baltimore and Pittsburgh, and in around 2 weeks, the strikes were smashed, and around 100 rail workers were dead. But even before Rutherford B. Hayes sent in the troops, the outcome of the Long Depression may have already been set in place, as the crisis disrupted Hayes' predecessor, Ulysses S. Grant, and his effort to complete Reconstruction in the South and protect the newly won rights of former black slaves. It was not only the boom that came after the Depression, but also the disruption of socialist struggle that occurred within those long years that created a crisis. In 1929, the Marxist philosopher Heinrich Grossman wrote that a crisis within capitalism is not only a moment of failure and disintegration, but it is also a tendency towards breakdown, which has been interrupted and restrained from realizing itself completely. However, Grossman also believed that there was a longer trend within capitalism that would eventuate in the collapse of capitalism, an end when no countervailing force would be available, and the choice would be, as Rosa Luxemburg put it, between barbarism and socialism.
No. Oh, come now, Street, I think you will. Of course, there is a distinct possibility that you won't. But there is only one way to find out, eh, Street? Yes. Only one way.
Well, video rangers, not a very pretty picture up there aboard the Orion. There. And as all you rangers know, a good combination is sometimes hard to get, but it's mighty pleasant. Whether it's a combination of colors or a combination of flavors. And right here, Rangers, is one of the best.
Looking back over the past 12 years, and especially considering the actions of the last 2 months, it's clear that the left is in no way ready to interrupt, but is instead accidentally assisting in capital's next transformation. This is what Adorno charged the new left with, and it is what I'd charge today's left with as well. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.